All right. It is December 19, 2025, Friday. Welcome to the Borderlines podcast. We are live. Deanna is sick today, but we are joined by possibly our most frequent guest. Not sure, but possibly Amandeep Hire, who literally wrote the book on citizenship by descent. And now that citizenship law has been amended and the new rules have taken effect, who better to have on than the person who wrote the book? Amandeep, thanks for coming back on. Oh, I think we lost him. But what I will do just to set the stage before Amandeep comes back is to just introduce. Oh, he's back. Perfect.
Sorry, I think I
Hit the wrong button. Okay, Amandeep is back. First, one thing we will note is that there is a Reddit thread that we discovered where people were talking about Amandeep's mic, and a person who I believe called himself in Canadian law said, Amandeep, you're on the Borderlines podcast all the time. Get a better mic. And what was funny about this was that another person said, I think he lurks on this sub. And sure enough, it's true because Amandeep sent me the picture from him lurking on the sub. So hopefully Amandeep's mic is up and running and up to snuff. The other thing that I want to address right off the bat is that Amandeep does not work for me. I'm not his receptionist. Since his
wait.
last
What?
episode, right? Since his last few appearances, I'll get usually about an email a week saying, hey, what does Amandeep think about this? Can you ask Amandeep this? And I'll say, why don't you ask him? So Amandeep's email is Amandeep at hayerlawoffice.ca. I know not everyone will watch until the end, so I wanted to address this at the outset. If you want to contact Amandeep and with a question about citizenship by descent or anything like that, his email is amandeep at hayerlawoffice. We'll include a link in the show notes as well. Amandeep, how's it been going?
Been a very interesting set of months. Let's just say it that way.
Because you spoke at the Senate on Bill C3 or the House of Commons or both?
I did at the Senate, and I did help write the submissions by the CBA to the House of Commons on Bill C3. And I don't know if anyone's, for those of you who watched, they know that there was two takeaways from that. One, we had asked that adoptees be included, and some sort of rewrite for adoptees where they're deemed to be Canadian citizens since at least the date of their adoption, if not their date of birth. Our second item there was we had asked for the government to simplify the Citizenship Act because it still makes no sense. Even with these amendments, it's very difficult to follow, even for me, who, as you mentioned, I wrote a book on the topic. I've spoken to the Senate, and yeah.
Could we pause just before we get into the substantive topic of this episode, which is after the new changes to citizenship by descent, are you now a Canadian? To just
Mhm.
pause on, someone was talking to me about opportunities in law and how careers progress. And you were mentioning before we went on that citizenship by descent is now a substantial part of your practice. Were you doing a lot of citizenship law before you wrote the book?
Not to this extent. I mean, I've gone from citizenship by descent. I mean, it's always been a big part of my practice. It's just been my unique expertise. It's just the volume has gone up considerably. I mean, just put in perspective, this time when they announced Bill C-71, it's me and one other person working together. We're now up to two lawyers, sorry, article student, and a bunch of assistants, and that just happened overnight. It felt like, but it has. It is an area which has exploded effectively.
So like would if just if someone was considering writing a book on a topic, having seen kind of how it impacted your career, would you recommend it?
Yes.
Well, short and easy answer.
Yeah. Although I will say, I think a lot of the explosion in the work was more not just the book, but also just the changes that have come down.
Hmm. Do you have to rewrite the book now that the changes have come down?
We're expecting it, both Lisa and I. We're
Fun
expecting a second
times.
edition at some point, but we're trying not to get too much attention to that right now.
Yeah. So let's get into the ways that someone can be a Canadian. I think the most straightforward and one that we probably don't have to spend too much time on is if they're born in Canada.
Yeah. Born in
Simple enough.
Canada, Section 31A of the Citizenship Act, you're a Canadian citizen if you're born in Canada, or Section 31G if you're born before 1977.
Yeah. And I think that that's easy enough for anyone to understand. It's a bit of a contested area right now, at least in the United States. The whole notion that if you're born in a place, you're a citizen there. It's a bit unique to the Western Hemisphere, but that's, that's the simple. If you're born in Canada, you are Canadian. The more complicated one is citizenship by descent. Do you want to spend maybe 2 minutes on how it was before these changes and 2 minutes on how it is now?
All right, so there's two things to keep in mind with citizenship by descent law. This is true for pretty much every country. It is largely determined by your date of birth and your place of birth and your parents. That's what it is. So up until about 1977, men and women were not equal under the Canadian Citizenship Act. A married man could pass on his citizenship to his children, but a married woman could not. Vice versa, an unmarried woman could pass on her Canadian citizenship to her children, but a married woman could not. In addition, up until about 77, there was a bunch of complex registration requirements that had to be met by, I think the exact date was August 17th, 2004. And this is for everyone born before 77 to make it even more complicated. So there's a number of things that existed during that period, which made citizenship by descent very complicated. In addition, up until January 1st, 1947, there was no Canadian citizenship. Everyone in Canada was a British subject. And the reason for this is more historic. Canada technically did not get its independence until January 1st, 1947. Say until until 1930, but because of depression, World War II, all that was kind of happening around the same time. We didn't pass any citizenship law, Canadian citizenship law, until January 1st, 1947, and we really didn't fully divorce our laws from the United Kingdom until 1982. So very slow, drawn out process. One of the things with that, though, was the British Nationality Act. We were governed by legislation both in Ottawa and in the United Kingdom, or St. John's for people in Newfoundland, because Newfoundland didn't join Canada until 1949. And under those laws, there's a lot of similar discrimination. For example, up until 1932, women who married foreign nationals automatically became citizens, so automatically lost their British nationality. So this became a real issue moving forward. People are discovering later in life that they're not Canadian. One of the biggest groups were the children of war brides, and they were waking up discovering they're not Canadian. The reason they're not Canadian is because either it was the wrong gender or the parent had died and the mother remarried before January 1st, 1947. Another group was individuals who pretty much spent their whole lives in Canada and discovered they weren't Canadian. And starting in about 1997, the Supreme Court of Canada said, well, this has to be fixed. You can't just retroactively apply gender discrimination because that's what the law said back then. And we've been playing this weird game of ping pong with the courts and the federal government since then. In Canada, our courts are a little different. They usually punt everything back to Parliament to make the final determination. So Parliament would release a very narrowly scoped statute saying, here's how we're going to fix it. They fix that one issue that the court identified, but they ignore a bunch of others. And now what's happened is in 2023, the Bjorkquist decision came down.
Do you want to
And
pause before we get to 2023 to just say what the 2009 change was?
Sure. So in 2009, what they said was anyone born after January 1st, 1947, inside or outside of Canada, is a Canadian citizen if they were either born in Canada, naturalized in Canada, or born outside of Canada and their parent was Canadian on their date of birth. And that was the change. In 2014, they extended it to everyone born before 1947. or 49 in the case of Newfoundland. The main thing there, though, they limited everything to the first generation. And one of the things we found in our practices was everything kind of just got pushed back down one generation. So that gender discrimination, which applied to children, now applied to grandchildren. And what we were starting to see was, well, that became an issue by 2023 when the Bajorquist decision came out. It actually didn't address that issue, but for once, Parliament looked at the statute holistically and said, all right, there's also this other issue. Let's fix both of them.
And so the change essentially that we have now, and
Mhm.
maybe this is an oversimplification, is that it's almost like you know, everybody who is a descendant of someone who is a citizen before is now a citizen, and starting now we're introducing new rules for people going forward.
For the most part, yeah, that's the rules. There are some I've noticed that also on that Reddit thread I've been lurking on, people have been interpreting random sections. For the most part, my interpretation is if you've had a Canadian ancestor, you are probably Canadian, and I'm basing this off of previous interpretations of those sections because there were exceptions to that first generation limit.
Before we get into maybe some of the issues that may arise from that, what is the new test for people going forward who are born abroad?
So if you're born December 16th or later, you're deemed to be a Canadian citizen if your parent lived in Canada for 1,095 days. Anyone before that, oh, and your parent was also Canadian, obviously. Anyone before that, there is no limit. For the most part, if you had a Canadian parent, you're Canadian today. If they had a Canadian parent, so on and so forth. And it keeps going up that way.
Yeah. And that's, for those who are reading along, that's 1,095 days cumulative, my understanding, not
Mhm.
consecutive.
Correct.
What were some of the different, as this was going through committee, some of the different, like, do you think this resolves the issue in Borkfest, which basically was like you had these people in that litigation. We did an episode with Suji Chowdhury, who was the
Mhm.
lawyer in that, and like, you know, you had scenarios of people who spent time in Canada, but maybe were abroad on vacation or something like that, and there were substantial ties to Canada. I give the example of we once had to, you know, seek a redetermination on a visitor visa for the child of a Canadian citizen by descent who was in South Africa, had a baby, and they tried to bring the baby back, and it was refused on the basis that because both parents were Canadian citizens, it was unlikely that the baby would go back to South Africa. And this, it was overturned, but it was an example of some of the absurdities that the law was causing. Do you think this resolves the issue in Borkfest?
Yeah, actually, in fact, about 4 or 5 years ago, I wrote an opinion piece for the Canadian Bar Association saying we should have a residency-based test. This is what the U.S. uses for its citizenship by descent legislation, and now it's what we're using as well. Um, I mean, the reality is the problem with the first generation limit is that it's arbitrary. Somebody could be living in Canada, have a bunch of ties to Canada, but just by a fluke happen to be born in the US and also happen to have a child born in the US. The best example, obviously, I can give is somebody lives in a small town on the prairies where the closest hospital might have been in the US. Both
Mm,
mom and daughter go into emergency labor and they just have to rush her to the closest hospital. Um, the other example, we live in the lower mainland. What if you go into labor while you're cross border shopping? It was a very, it was an unworkable test, I think, for the most part. This is a lot fairer. Um, I know there's some other things which were proposed. For example, I think the Conservatives had proposed 1,095 days over a rolling 5-year period.
hmm
They'd also,
Basically, to make it the same as the test for becoming a citizen.
yeah, and they had also proposed another interesting one, which was 1,095 days consecutive. And I was like, that's totally unworkable.
Didn't they
Um,
also propose language tests, or was that
they
going
did.
backwards?
That was the blocks. They said moving forward after your 18th birthday, if you apply for proof of citizenship, you had to prove your language. But I found that was a bit interesting because the particular section said you are Canadian. how can you impose a language test after 18 if you were Canadian up until 18? I just didn't think it was legally workable.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe if they put it part of the naturalization requirement and just moved second generation into naturalization, that could have worked, but that's not what they chose to do.
So we have a series of changes that took effect December 15. The first generation limit is removed. Someone is a Canadian citizen. Essentially, if they can trace it back, you were on a previous episode here discussed different ways to go about trying to prove that. What are you seeing in your practice when it comes to
Yeah.
proving the going back?
So originally, one of the things we always did is we try to get birth certificates from the provinces. One of the things we're finding is, particularly out east, birth certificates are very difficult to find. So we're increasingly using other evidence. The most common I'm increasingly relying on are census records. So if we have census records either from the US or Canada saying my parent was born in Canada, that's usually good enough. Some alternate evidence I've used is naturalization records. Usually they'll say this person was the subject of His Majesty or Her Majesty Queen Victoria, um, and we'll use that. So we are changing some of our processes, um, but we also always ask the province for a birth certificate to begin.
Now, something that someone asked, I think on the CBA listserv, was let's say that someone's great grandmother or father was a Canadian born in Canada, and it's the great grandchild. Do you have to do individual applications for each step along the way, such that grandpa has, I'm just using, the gender term, grandpa has to be a citizen, then dad has to be a citizen? Do you have to do individual citizenship proofs for each person along the way, or can you start with the great grandchild?
Start with the great grandchild, but in my submission letters, I always prove how each individual above became Canadian. So let's say, Steve, you were my client. I'd say, Steve was born after, I'm assuming you were born after 1977. You were a Canadian citizen in Section 31B. Your parent was a citizen in Section 31G. Your grandparent was a citizen under Section 31K, so on and so forth. It's just one example I'm citing. And we would go through that entire analysis. And we would also look at the old acts. I find that's the best way of doing it. It makes the job for IRCC easier. But you actually don't even need to do that. Technically, you can just submit the application saying my granddad was born in Canada, here's my grandparent, here's my here's my mom, here's me. That
Hmm.
might actually be good enough.
Now, one of the things that had arisen was that in the interim between the court decision and the law taking effect, the government had introduced these interim measures
Mhm.
whereby people could apply for Canadian citizenship. Um, and if there were urgent reasons, they could grant it. The IRCC website now says that if you've applied under these measures, we're going to continue to process them. Are there, like, from what you saw, were there people who wouldn't pass under the current test, like people who really had no tie who were applying?
Not well, if they did, I told them at the beginning, no, you can't apply. I also was starting to see a bunch of people who naturalize and like, oh, I have grandkids who were born outside the country. Like, no. Um, where, and I'm sure people did. I'm sure people who had no real ties probably heard this, they applied. I never did. Um, I would not be comfortable doing that. So the way it works, generally speaking, if you have these interim measures policies, they're going to revert back now to a proof application, and you'll be issued citizenship as a proof. One of the things I did see in public discussion was there was some people saying it was easier under the interim measures than under the new law. That's not true. The interim measures assume that the new law would go into effect as is. Although I did tell people that we don't know what the final version of the bill looked like, but basically the bill passed identically from the
Mhm.
start to finish. Um, so if you have something in the interim measures, you're probably going to get a certificate one day in the mail saying you've been a Canadian since your date of birth,
Is
rather
there an
than
estimated processing time, like 1 day?
officially 8 months. Realistically, it could be anything. I've had some approved in a month, mostly first generation born abroad. I've had some take about 12 months. It's been about the average I'm noticing. And I've had at least one which is up to 24 months. And that's usually somebody sitting on someone's desk and it has not been. picked up, and we're trying to wake up the file now.
Now, an issue that arises, and we took over another file from another lawyer where this had arisen, is you may have, let's say, an American who needs to come and work in Canada, and he's a citizenship, he's a citizen, he's by descent, but he needs to start working right away. Can he apply for a work permit if he is eligible for citizenship by descent? Is he stuck through the slower process because he's a citizen, ironically? Like, what happens there?
So what happens there is you're in a limbo. You are not allowed to apply for a work permit if you're a Canadian citizen. You are a Canadian citizen and have been one since your date of birth. So you have two choices. Renounce your Canadian citizenship, which is going to take about a year, or apply for proof. But you can apply for proof urgently. And before this current wave, proof applications urgently were coming within about 2 weeks, so it wasn't too bad. Now it's harder to say. That being said, you are a Canadian just like me and Steve. Technically, you're allowed to come up here and work. There's nothing in the law preventing it. You just don't have proof. So if you do get caught, you're going to be stuck trying to prove that you're Canadian. And I have represented at least one person at the immigration division where I said, "This person is Canadian. We just don't have the proof. They've been Canadian their whole life," and that ended up
So if
getting
they're
me.
at the immigration division, what was the allegation, that they had worked without authorization, or?
They had stayed in Canada without authorization. We just pointed out that their father was born in Canada, proved that they were born in Canada. The ID dismissed it on that basis, but CPSA did try to deport them and said you can't deport a Canadian citizen for working and living in Canada.
What was CBSA's rationale for not just backing off?
I don't know. They were saying that he has to get the application approved before he's Canadian. I said, no, the law clearly says he's Canadian since his date of birth.
Oh, that's interesting. So they took the position that you're only a citizen by birth if you have an application that's approved.
Yeah.
But that gets
The
to the
ID.
whole issue of that kind of complicated scenario for that work permit applicant, or that person who wants to apply or who wants to work, because they can't get a work permit because they're Canadian, but it takes months to get proof that they're Canadian.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're in a weird spot there because, again, you are Canadian, you just don't have proof. Technically, they can work. Now, they also need a social insurance number, which is where you're actually going to end up having problems. But they're Canadian, just like me, just like you. They're not
Yeah.
entitled to a work permit. They really shouldn't be applying for a work permit because that's in bad faith as well.
Yeah. And so, just as Amandeep was saying, it's Section 3 of the Act says, subject to this Act, a person is a citizen if, and there's no need for an application to be approved first. What could happen, though, I mean, even if CBSA lets that person in to work and says, you're right, you're a citizen, they're going to have issues getting a SIN number. So they are left in a, I mean, it's, the classic processing times cause issues.
Yeah. And
The,
you're in limbo.
yeah. The other issue that arises that you hear on Reddit, and I don't know how big an issue that it is. Actually, before I get to that, you have had different numbers, I think. How many people do you think are now citizens?
I think it's in the millions. So the government's official quote is about 150,000.
I saw
But if
that.
you look at, yeah, then you listen to the testimony they gave to the Senate. They said, oh, well, our estimate ranges from 150,000 to 4 million. Now, here's something I want you to think about. The Canadian border was very porous with the US for most of its history. People had relationships across the border. If you look at it, and if you look at my Toronto Star article from a while ago, we had estimated at least 20% to 40% of the population of just New England has a French Canadian ancestor, so not even English Canadian. When you start doing that estimate, we're getting to probably 20 million or more. It's quite high, the figure. And I mean, just some famous people I've noted. Hillary Clinton has a Canadian ancestor. The president, the majority leader in the Senate, has a Canadian ancestor. Tucker Carlson, I just discovered, has a Canadian ancestor. So there you go, 3 people, including Tucker Carlson, who thinks that having dual citizenship makes you a traitor to the United States. So, Tucker, you need to do something about that.
So, like, what would happen? Like, because so I mean, one thing we hadn't talked about was in the historic legislation, there would have been people who renounced their citizenship. Does that impact their ability now of their descendants to be citizens by descent?
If the descendants were born after the renunciation, they're not citizens. That citizenship has been extinguished.
So that
If they're
remains.
if they're born before, it depends on how they renounced whether or not they're Canadian. One
So
thing people,
when you're doing the, that great grandparent and you're looking at birth certificate down to birth certificate down to birth certificate, how can you tell if someone renounced their citizenship along the way?
usually there's a record at the federal government, so we don't usually know. One thing I do want everyone to know is a lot of people come to me say, "Oh, we renounced," and what they meant was they took the U.S. oath of renunciation. That doesn't count. It has to be a formal application. You applied with the government of Canada saying, "I will renounce." The moment you renounce, your citizenship ceases.
So
Very
there
simple.
isn't a way really for, the grandchild to learn if grandpa resign, especially if grandpa's deceased,
Yeah.
if they relinquish their citizenship. So there could be millions of citizens out there, primarily in the United States.
Mhm.
If you go on Reddit, one of the things some of the more anti-immigrant, anti-India in particular, as we'll get
Mhm.
to with our first YouTube comment, will say is, okay, they're going to find someone with the last name Singh in some registry somewhere that's being born in Canada, and there's going to be a whole trail now of this guy had a kid in Punjab, and now that guy had a kid, and that there's going to be all sorts of fake, impossible to prove birth certificate trails abroad. How big a concern is that?
I don't think it's a big concern because that original person is going to have some sort of relevant biodata that was recorded when they immigrated to Canada. So Canada did keep records of people entering the country. That's the first thing you have to trace back to. If that biodata starts to, and we usually can tell from that biodata if it's the same person because names change a lot, especially from certain communities. Not so much the Punjabi community, but I do notice like a lot of Jewish community names changed. A lot of Eastern European names changed after they moved to Canada. But usually you can go from that. That gives much, much more detailed information. So I could tell you who the father was, where they entered, where they were born, all of that. When you start getting fake documents, the fake documents are going to be very difficult to prove. The other part to that to keep in mind is it doesn't apply to anyone who did not become Canadian. It gets a little complicated pre 1947 because Indians were also British subjects, but the only way they got there was a number of very restrictive rules on which Indian British subject got Canadian domicile, which was then required. It gets very complicated. A lot of them were actually just sent back right away, so communities can be very small.
Mm.
So one of the requirements was you had to do a direct flight from India on a ship all the way to Vancouver, which really wasn't possible back then.
That's the whole Kamagata with the continuous
Yeah,
journey regulation.
yeah.
So, I mean, the risk appears small. One of the things too that's interesting is like, a lot when we talk about how many people this encompasses, there's a bit of nervousness in the conservatives. Like
Mhm.
Spain, I was reading Portugal, like had, you know, hundreds of people lined up at the Portuguese embassy or consulate in Israel because like Spain did basically citizenship for anyone who was expelled in the Inquisition. And so
Mhm.
other countries have also had these big citizenship initiatives where that would have been eligible for an unknown number of people, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think the number, like I said, it's a very large number. The government, I don't think they have a full handle on how large this number could be. Um, and I can just put this in perspective. I had a consult about now 6 months ago, I believe. Person was looking for some option to come to Canada. I said, well, why don't we just look at this? Just out of fun. We went on Ancestry, and lo and behold, one of their parents was the father of Confederation. As I say, their ancestors was the father of Confederation. And I think the number is very high, and I don't know the exact figure. Well,
And look who just joined, Lisa Middlemiss. We are live,
Hello.
Lisa, before you. say anything where you're like, not that you would be like, let me tell you about this client. We are live on YouTube right now.
Amazing.
Lisa is Amandeep's co-author, and we've just been talking about Bill C3 and everything. And actually, I want to start with the same question that I initiated with Amandeep, maybe for you as well. Do you find that having written this book, Citizenship by Descent, has become a big part of your practice?
It just keeps growing. I feel like I'm shocked how many inquiries there are, and it's such a different kind of practice too, like doing this sort of archival or ancestry research. Like at first it really wasn't intuitive, and as we go, get into the files and the client situations, it gets a little bit easier. But yeah, I find it's fascinating at a time that immigration is becoming so difficult and so restrictive that the citizenship can be in this like great expansion.
Right. So one of the things we were talking about with Amandeep also, and when you joined, was, you know, different concerns that have been expressed, mainly in some conservative quarters, about the prospect of millions of people suddenly becoming citizens. From the Quebec perspective, that would be millions of Anglophones. So has this taken on any unique dimension in Quebec?
Yes, well, it's interesting how you phrase it like that. I think that the Quebec government is mostly focused on immigration, so they're not even necessarily connected to this sort of federal question about citizenship. There's been a lot of outcry or fear about birth tourism and whatnot in Quebec, so this is sort of a similar spin. But I think that there hasn't actually been too much of a fear factor around. The numbers of citizenship claims. But it's interesting because a lot of these cases are Quebec based. Like it seems like, or maybe it's just they're
Mhm.
finding me because my practice is in Quebec. And I know Amandeep, but we've talked like these getting the Quebec birth certificates and whatnot is always challenging, and a lot of Americans. So it could be a concern, but I think no one's really twigged onto it yet on the public level.
I'm finding the same thing. A lot of them have a Quebec connection. Almost all of them are being traced back to Quebec.
Interesting.
And Lisa knows this. At least once a week, I'll call her up like, "Hey, I just did the submission to Quebec. Can you review our French?"
Why are they applying? Is it a Trump thing? Do they actually want to move
Yes.
here?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think.
Security blanket, Trump.
Yeah, I've also seen a lot of LGBTQ Americans,
Hmm.
especially, take advantage of this.
That's true.
So that's been one of the biggest factors.
Do you know, and a consultant told me that they were under the impression that when it came to the interim measures, LGBTQ were being prioritized.
They were.
They were.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be, yes. I mean, I think things slowed down a bit with the interim measures just before the entry into force of Bill C3. But yes, at the beginning, there was more of an uptake.
Interesting. Yeah, because that person said that they had represented like brother and sister, and one was expedited super quick, and the
Hmm.
other, I don't know what the status of. Um, but so that were there other groups that were prioritized? Is it still going to be prioritized now, or do you just get a sense that everything's slowing? Or
I think it's everyone's falling into the same triage now, if you will. So, and even the cases submitted before under interim measures with urgency, I'm not seeing a lot of uptake or finalization. I
Yeah.
guess now they're no longer like an exceptional grant. They're now getting rooted as a regular proof, presumably on the back end of things. I don't know if you guys were talking about that, but I'm a little unclear as to, I guess we're in the dark in terms of what's going on the inside of IRCC to triage these applications now.
I mean, I can just talk about my own practice. It's blown up in the last year. Lisa's seen it. We used to have like weekly meetings that would be like, "Oh, I've got about these many files coming in." This is just me, one lawyer in Vancouver. I can only imagine what's going on in Sydney. And Sydney's not really set up to take on a large volume of cases as well.
Sydney being where they process these applications in Nova Scotia, not Australia.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I
And
actually
yeah,
might be
and
going to Nova Scotia next year. Maybe I'll check out Sydney. I've never been to the Maritimes.
yes, you should try to maybe receive a tour. It'd be good to know what's happening on the inside.
A
Right.
live podcast from CPC Sydney.
Maybe before we get to questions, you'd mentioned what are some of the ongoing issues? I know there's been chatter about adoption.
Yeah, so adoptions where I think we might have a future constitutional challenge, which might once again open up this issue. One of the things is, and this is something now I'm discovering, is people are coming to me as adults. They're well into their 30s. They were adopted by a Canadian parent, but they lived in the US. They've had children of their own. Well, if I apply for citizenship by adoption, it's effective on the date the adoption application is approved. However, if what that means is they have children of their own, they're not Canadian. But if their sibling who's naturally born has children, let's say same dates of birth for everyone, those children are Canadian. So you have this unequal treatment based on adoptees versus non-adoptees. Then I go back to the decision in Benner in Canada from the Supreme Court in 1997. You can't treat people differently. That was the ruling of the court.
And it's interesting how IRCC is taking the position that, you know, this is just it's just a function of how the direct grant by adoption works, and this is not unconstitutional. But I think they themselves know that there's something there too, but they didn't have the energy to try to fix it in this effort to meet the ORCIS test in a hurry, let's say.
When you're going back in time to do your, our great-grandparent, our grandparent was adopted, and you discover that there was an adoption along the way. So does that change any of the analysis in terms of whether the current kid is Canadian?
It does. It stops right there. So there is no citizenship by descent. That's the end of it.
It's
However, I
unfortunate.
am finding that adoptions were a lot rarer back then too. So I think thus far I've only had one where we said adopted can't do it.
And that's just because of the way the Citizenship Act defines who's a child, doesn't include adoption.
Yeah.
And then I guess it goes without saying it doesn't include step parents.
Yeah, that's another common group because they'll adopt their children also as adults after they've lived together for a very long time. And another one I discovered the other day was in the US, you can have 3 parents. If your step parent adopts you, all 3 are recognized as your parent, and that will never apply.
Yeah. Wow.
That's state by state, or is that?
I think it's state by state. I've only seen it out of California. So.
Yeah.
But okay. I guess, yeah, people are just not doing it though, right? Like, and if it stops with the adoption though, you know, the proof application isn't submitted, so they're not getting challenged on it now until someone decides to go and take it to the next level constitutionally.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I don't think somebody who had a great-great-grandparent who was adopted is really sympathetic, but I think somebody very recently will be. Like, example I can give somebody here in Blaine, who the nearest school is UBC. They might actually have something.
Interesting. Okay, we are going to hit up some questions. And as I said at the outset, a lot of the questions might not be related to the actual topic that we discussed. The first one is more a comment, and well, I'll just post it up, which is by Racehead, which is do whatever, call it what you want. We call it an invasion. Go home and make your own countries better. You've ruined this country. Look at Brampton. So a ringing endorsement in our first YouTube comment of immigration. I want to spin this to like kind of what we were talking about though, just in terms of certain reactions to this bill. And I don't know if this comment pertains to the bill or immigration in general, but have you, just maybe to expand on any negative reaction that you've received the more you talk about this, or kind of some of the concerns raised by both the Bloc and the Conservatives?
I'll be honest, I've received, like, there's been mostly, even on social media, the reaction to this bill has been mostly positive.
Yeah.
Which I did think was interesting. It's also one of the sources of frustration I'm having is I do still have consults on the other side, and increasingly I'm having a hard time helping people.
You mean going to the States?
No, like for individuals
immigrants
who are in the country looking for permanent residence, and I'm like, I can't help you. I can't find a way.
Yeah. And there's some resentment there, unfortunately, I feel.
Yeah.
I felt that with some clients as well too. They've heard from their friends who suddenly had a Canadian ancestor, and boom, their future in Canada is magically transformed, whereas they could be here trying to renew their work permit if they're lucky enough to have an employer who will go through that process.
Yeah.
And the frustrating thing I see is usually they look like me, and that is something which has, I've noticed, just not with me. I have some South Asian staff as well. They feel the same thing.
Do they think there's a racial component to it, that it's difficult for Indian people to get, or people of Indian descent to get permanent residence, whereas like a bunch of Americans are about to become citizens? Or
let's say it's that 20 million Indians are about to become citizens. I think there would have been a much bigger uproar. Whereas we're seeing 20 million Americans have just become citizens. Oh, that's fine.
Well, and that goes to what we were talking about on Reddit, right? No one seems concerned that Americans may have fake birth certificates. All the discourse is how in China and India there's going to be fake birth certificates.
Yeah. I just
Very
want to
interesting.
really said. I just hope you don't go to an Indian restaurant if they were in Brampton.
What's the overall, I know we've talked on the podcast, federally, obviously, immigration, permanent residence is a bit of a sensitive topic. Here in British Columbia, I don't know if there's still an official party or not, because I think they lost or they've split, but One BC was running on an end to mass immigration. Quebec, is it an issue in the Quebec upcoming election? Or?
Oh, yes, very much. In fact, we already have an extremely restrictive immigration policy under the CAQ government, and the Parti Québécois is rising in the polls. So if ever we have a Parti Québécois elected, for sure our numbers are going to decline even further. And so sort of everyone is sort of fueling the fans of, immigrants and are here to take our jobs. But there's starting to be some voices from industry and even in the public, and some journalists who are covering how actually we're falling back because we don't have enough immigrants to fill very key labor shortages in the province. So we'll have to see how it all plays out, but it is pretty concerning.
Yeah. From Instagram, this was a question I anticipated getting, and I have no insight beyond what's public, but the possible TRPR pathway. I think everyone is kind of watching this. I don't think it's eligible if you're in Quebec. I think it's...
Well, unless you could prove you would leave, right, and have the intention to reside outside Quebec at the time of becoming a PR. But yeah.
Amandeep, do you have any thoughts on what it'll look like? I think the big question is, will it be in Metro Vancouver or purely rural?
Yeah, it's hard to say what it'll be. I mean, it's one of the things I should probably just add. The BCPNP has been more or less suspended for the past year, so there's a lot of people waiting here in BC. So it'll be interesting to see what this does. I don't know what it'll look like. I'll be 100% honest. It could just be a very, very nice Canadian experience class draw with a very low score.
And to those who don't know what we're talking about, the budget says that there's going to be a one-time initiative to transition 33,000 people from temporary status to permanent with no details. So
just get your Express Entry profile up. That's all I'm going to say.
What are you telling people?
Get your Express Entry profile up. It could just be like one huge 33,000 draw, right? So
that's interesting. That's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about it going through Express Entry, but I guess there's no reason why it couldn't. I was picturing some sort of very I don't know, crafted program like the TR to PR before, similarly to that, where there would be certain...
Got that language.
Yeah.
Except it uses the word skilled, which suggests that one way to do it would be, as Amandeep says, through Express Entry. I imagine if it's like the TR to PR, there'll be a Francophone and an Anglophone component, except that they have to hit their 33,000. And that's the thing. I don't think they have, outside of Quebec anyways, call it, if it's half of 33, 16,500 Francophones who are in skilled positions in Canada, because they would have already gotten draws. So it'll be interesting to see, but yeah, we don't have any unique insight. Other one from Instagram, kind of foreign doctor from the Middle East, apply for a work permit, please. Being from the Middle East isn't anything special in the question, but maybe Lisa first and then Amandeep. I know that the federal government has said that they're going to target 1,000 people who are working as doctors. to come and get permanent residence in the next year or two. And questions were asked, well, how do you even come here to work? So what is the process in Quebec?
So it's very well for anything that doesn't require a labor market test. It's similar to the rest of Canada. So for work permits for people who are from countries that Canada has a free trade agreement with, but if it is requiring like a labor market process, like a doctor, for example, from the Middle East, the hospital in Quebec would need to go through a labor market process. And so we do have a list of occupations that are in shortage, whereby employers don't actually need to advertise the positions, but it did become a lot more restrictive last year. So in a sense, it's similar. You also need to get some an approval from the Quebec authorities, basically Quebec immigration, which is processed in parallel to the LMIA. In order to be able to work in this province. So it's just a bit more bureaucracy.
Yeah, the extra level. What is it in British Columbia or ROC, rest of Canada?
Yeah, so it's going to vary from, okay, well, there's a global, same thing, labor market impact assessment. Although if you're from the Middle East, I'm going to note there's a good chance you speak French as well. So you could also get a Francophone mobility work permit, which
If you're
doesn't work
from the
for
Middle
Quebec.
East, there's a good chance you speak French.
Maybe Lebanon, but I haven't seen.
I was going to say, I
Lebanon.
think there's a good chance you speak Arabic or Farsi.
Oh, well, I'm just saying a lot of those, like North Africa, all the way down to Lebanon,
Okay.
are French colonies. So there's a lot of people there who speak French. It's something I have discovered. So it's a mobility Francophone work permit or significant benefit to Canada.
Yeah.
Or
one of the things that's odd about the program that they announced is that like Express Entry already has a healthcare category where if you've worked as a doctor for 6 months, you can get an ITA. So I don't see what the point of a program for physicians who've worked here a year is when presumably you'll qualify at the 6-month mark.
Well, a lot of those have been like Canadian experience class though, right? Like,
Yeah.
this last draw that we had last week was, Canadian experience class, all the, healthcare professions. So I guess to be like a foreign doctor, you'd have to be
Yeah.
invited for federal skilled worker.
Well, the new program though is supposed to be 1 year of Canadian work.
True. This new, proposed program.
There are some other
What's
issues
coming
with
up?
doctors, as we know. Express Entry was only amended maybe a year or two ago to let physicians who practice as self-employed count as Canadian work experience. I was contacted by, I don't actually remember if it was a lawyer or consultant, who was saying that another issues that are arising is you have, going back to the Middle East, these countries will send people here to work, but they're paid
To go
by
back.
they're paid by the country abroad.
Yeah.
And so there's refusals on the basis that that's
Oh.
not actually Canadian work.
Oh, I haven't had that before for the Saudi doctors. I've had, that's a common situation in Saudi Arabia, right? But I've never actually encountered that not being considered Canadian work experience. Typically, they only get a stipend from the Saudi bureau and also from the Canadian employer, but it's full-time work. It's like a stipend, but it's significant enough to I guess pay the necessities of life. And I haven't had pushback on that, even though ultimately they signed it. It's true that there is an agreement to go back and then apply their specialty in Saudi Arabia, for example. But I haven't actually seen IRCC refuse them. I have seen issues getting letters from those who, like institutions that employ them in Canada, to confirm that it is confirm the conditions of the Canadian work because of pressures from the Saudi bureau, perhaps.
I did want to add one more thing to that. I've also had a number of people who studied in Canada or were paid by their country back home. Canada doesn't care, but the licensing bodies do. So BC College of Physicians has actually denied some applications, saying one of your conditions was you're going back to Saudi Arabia. We're not going to license you. You don't meet our moral requirements.
So yeah, there's going to be a lot of a whole bunch of issues in terms of the healthcare, that healthcare draw and attracting doctors. Yadger on X says, any thoughts on federal processing for PMP plays? These days, an AOR is taking, an acknowledgement of receipt is taking a year. Everything is slow, it seems.
Everything is very slow. Even cases that are finalized, we're waiting for a decision. There's no decision yet. It seems like there's a standstill until the new year, and things hopefully take an uptick.
Yeah, I tweeted that is a thing but I don't know why the AORs are taking so
Longer.
long. And it creates these issues because, like, for the bridging open work permit, you need an acknowledgement of receipt, and yet those are taking longer and longer to get.
I think it's about shortages of staff. I could be wrong, but cuts at IRCC, I don't know. But I've noticed this too with the Quebec Selected Skilled Worker, which sort of functions in a way like a PNP. We've had delays on AORs on that front too, whereas we never did before. And as you say, it's impacting people's ability to apply for bridging open work permit. So there's a bit of a general slowdown.
Mm-hmm. The Quebec caps in general are. There's been a few mandamus decisions which basically say if it's Quebec causing the delay because of the caps, mandamus can't be used around that. And it sounds like it's only going to get worse from what you're saying in terms of numbers.
Yeah, I mean that's a very controversial topic though, because there's constitutional arguments though about that though, and whether Quebec actually can go to these extents in some cases, because they do have certain obligations under the Canada-Quebec Accord to welcome a certain number of immigrants proportional to our population within Canada. But it's true the courts haven't been very clement on this question.
Yeah. Has there been any comment in Quebec about how, like, the Francophone program turns into an indirect immigration program to Quebec? Like, I've heard that a lot of the people who arrive ultimately do move to Quebec, even though it's not supposed to be under express entry.
I've seen a few like that, like say spousal case, the person becomes, maybe they're on a Francophone mobility work permit in British Columbia, and then later they become a PR, they have rights under the charter, they then move to Quebec because they feel comfortable in Quebec. It's a full Francophone culture. And then, I might not be aware of it unless they come to me for a specific immigration service, like sponsoring their new spouse, for example.
Yeah. We got Hybrid Cyan 3020 takes on Bill C-12. Bill C-12 is the bill that the two main immigration provisions would be you can't declare refugee status if you've been in Canada for more than 1 year, and that IRCC can cancel pretty much anything that it wants.
Yeah. The first one, I'm a little bit more... I'll be blunt. I'm not as concerned about the first one. I do find that it's an interesting provision. The second one, it's arbitrary. Anytime you give the government arbitrary decision-making power, you're opening it up to a potential abuse process, and that's my concern. It should be based on the law. It should be based on some sort of legal process. I will say though, even on the refugee stuff, everyone has a right to due process. That's what this country's built on.
I think that's it. I think on both accounts, that's the problem, right? Like if someone comes to Canada and their country conditions change and, their life suddenly is at risk if they were sent back, then why shouldn't they be able to claim asylum? It's just, it doesn't make sense based on our history of rule of law. And I mean, in terms of the arbitrary cancellation of immigration documents, like it's very unsettling for people, I think, who are in Canada in this climate of not knowing, uncertainty. It's just, really a nightmare for immigration lawyers and their clients, I feel.
Do you think they're going to cancel any programs in 2026 and all the applications in the queue?
Well, they could if they suspect program integrity issues and fraud, right? Unfortunately, there have been some issues, with certain programs, and this would be kind of a blanket way to just move on, right? And regardless of the collateral damage to those who may not have been involved in any nefarious business.
Yeah, the OIMP did that. I think the big three, yes. What about H&C, self-employed class, startup visa? All of those programs have 10+ year processing times.
Yeah, again, difficult to even consider that as an option in some ways, but I guess they are often last resort options anyways. If we were to play the devil's advocate, the agency option is already pretty risky. But I mean, the fact that you might not find out and you'll have to live in limbo for 10 years is also goes against Canada's humanitarian tradition, in my opinion.
I just want to say, I mean, a lot of this could be solved in terms of program integrity with enforcement. And That's been the real issue. There's just a lack of enforcement. We don't have the manpower, personnel, I should say, to actually enforce our laws. And same thing with the refugee decisions. The main reason they're doing this, they don't have enough hearings officers. So that's not the person applying's fault. That's the fault of the government.
I mean, for sure, the restrictions on immigration have pushed some people to live underground lives in Canada. I think we could say I never had seen that before in previous years. People who may have lived in Canada for years and for some time without status and are prepared to continue doing so. It's this feature of all of the cuts and the lack of ways of or imagination to sort of regular or try to look at regularizing certain sets of people like they did with the construction workers in Toronto.
Mm-hmm. Last question for each of you. Prediction for 2026 as we get into the new year. What are you expecting? I think a lot of lawyers, consultants, and especially clients found 2025 to be a bit tough, unless you suddenly became a citizen with the end of in December and like you're one of the possible millions of Americans who just became a citizen. For people who are here, it's been tough anyway. What are you expecting in 2026?
More citizenship by descent. That's what I think is going to be a lot more of our practice, maybe more family class. I do think come end of 2026, we're going to see a bit more of a balancing out of the immigration system, where the TR intake and the permanent resident draws will be a bit more measured. So you will start seeing more people having pathways to permanent residence. But for people who are here, who came in the last 3 years, it's going to be very difficult.
I second that. I can only predict that people will need an immigration lawyer. It's unbelievable how many people at a time when immigration is so restrictive, how many queries we have, how many situations, like people are really trying to unpack things and be creative and look at their options and their employers as well. So I think it's going to be another year of trying to be very strategic and take an opportunity when an opportunity is available. If it's going to be this one-time TR to PR program, if it comes to fruition, we'll have to be ready to jump on it. Or in Quebec,
there's a lot of one time.
Yeah.
One thing I've noticed too is that there seems to be a lot more of I guess in express entry, you have to declare what knock you think your position is. And when you read refusals, it'll be like the visa officer will essentially say, well, I actually saw one that was you put that you were a software developer, but it looks closer to an information systems tech. And you're like, who cares? Who cares? Even if technically the law, another one going back to doctors, our firm this year had to step in for someone whose express entry and bridging work permit was refused because they lost points after their foreign work experience didn't state explicitly that they were paid as a doctor. And again, you're I understand what the law is, but really, there's just a certain lack of common sense that arguably is required by the law that seems to be becoming a bigger and bigger issue.
Or my personal favorite, engineers. For us lawyers, it's one knock. For engineers, it's 24. And every time I have an engineering client, they'll go, what about this one? What about this one? It's any of them. You fall into any of them.
But I feel like there's a little bit more of a focus on whether that is the case.
Mm-hmm. There's digging on the knock for sure in express entry. There's scrutiny that there didn't seem to be before. But again, there's levels, right? There's low levels, so they're looking at ways of cutting, and refusals are a low-lying fruit.
That's been the big change this year. Also, is this boasting of how low approval rates were and how few people were arriving. It's been very weird to see that throughout the year. Deanna's talked about before how there wasn't a change in the law, yet approval rates fell. What is that?
And at ESTC too.
Yep, and it's all being pushed into the federal court, which is now at 30,000 applications, and a lot of them, at least the ones I'm seeing, are getting overturned, and now we're just going back into the cycle where they're back into processing, and maybe they'll get refused again, maybe they'll be issued.
Yeah. Did you see the federal court had they're consolidating where there's 400 plus applications filed by one ghost who used the same phone number pretending to be the applicant in all 400 plus of the applications.
Oh my gosh.
I
Yeah.
saw one
Wow.
with the credit card. They found the same credit card number was used, and
Wow.
Interesting.
Troubling.
I've seen a couple refusals where somebody will request a refund while their application's in process, and IRC has alleged that it's misrep because they're trying to immigrate for free.
Really?
Yeah.
That's odd.
That it's a fake chargeback. Anyway,
Huh.
this has been great. Thanks for dropping in, Lisa, and joining us. It's great.
This was so fun.
Yeah.
Good to
We'll
see
have
you
to do
guys.
it more in the new year.
Absolutely.